I'm so excited to welcome you all to the Writer Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. My name is Emily Holland, and I'm thrilled to have Karen Rigby with us tonight to celebrate her collection, Fabulosa. Karen, thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Zach and the Writer Center for hosting this so generously, and thank all of you for joining us. So I thought I would begin by telling you just a little bit about myself. I'm a poet who was born in Panama, and I have lived in Pittsburgh and Minneapolis, and I'm now speaking to you from Arizona. I'm the author of 2 books. The first was from Ahsahta Press, Chinoiserie, and the second one that I'm speaking about today is Fabulosa from JackLeg Press. And I'd like to begin, I see a question in the chat. I am coming to you from Gilbert, specifically. I thought I would begin with the book's opening poem, since we'll be talking about it as we go, and it sets the blueprint for everything else that follows. So the first poem is an Ars Poetica. Why my poems arrive wearing black gloves, like twin gauntlets set on the margin. Enter the female assassin, the screwball debutante, noir and glitz mixed in one bad throwback to an age when dahlias bowled anyone who breathed them. My poems arrive wearing satin or suede to haunt you when they leave no trace. I've watched a man pull off his gloves with his teeth. The trick to undoing the wolf behind the saint is to make a slow-mo invitation of it. Because there's never a plot unless one of us goes missing. That's me at the aerodrome and you boarding a custard plane. Now fly at the sultry wind before you vanish. That's the tension we need. I love an overblown image, a drawer full of hands wave in a solemn motorcade. My gloves pantomime moods so thick you could ladle gravy. About my first book, a critic wrote, I'm a little bored with the aesthetic. If that isn't damning, what is? My poems wear black to turn the dial and bag the ice. In the director's cut, I'm driving the hairpin curve when the camera rolls back to show you looking louche, but alive. You were always in on it. A poem is a diamond heist. Tell the critic, no one watches a woman enter a room to look at her hands, just like no one's reading this poem to picture my life. But a black glove peeled down the avenue of my arm, what wouldn't you do? I'll read you the second poem, which is inspired by an Olympic figure skate. To Johnny Weir on I Love You, I Hate You. Transgression isn't hot pink boarding down the center of your chest as much as the articulated pose. Each muscle frozen in exuberance. The AP photo I love for your green-eyed envy of nothing and no one, elbows out, fingers splayed in sheer black gloves, the instant I think you know. Each sequence is obsession honed to art, each edge of fretwork left on ice. It isn't the single tassel, also pink, no apology, or the oil slick corset, but how performance masks the hours. The sound of blades beneath the music, the Colosseum breathless at the next jump. It isn't a boy beginning to dream in Quarryville, a cornfield swarmed in snow with the speed of desire. Each clockwise spin, each gesture a spiked rose. When de Blasio's rumba turns, I think of nights I woke in Pittsburgh alone, dogwood beginning to open, the avenue stippled in orange light. I wanted nothing and everything. In that brick pre-war apartment, I lived through seasons of no answer. The end of grief is the beginning of fire, as when the last note sunders air. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for reading those poems, which I think really introduce so much of the collection, but also give us a lot to talk about. And you already told us a little bit about you, so maybe we'll dive into our first question here, which, since this is a chat about the craft of writing, I'm wondering, where in the writing process for you do you think about craft the most? When are you most aware of that more mechanical side of writing or drafting versus that more free-flowing or intuitive side?
I think for poets, it's pretty common to think of craft in terms of editing or revision or that kind of tinkering and refinement that you do once you already have material. But for me, craft is much broader than that. It begins way further back, even before you've started to think about a poem. So to speak about that, I'll give you a little analogy. There's an artist, Joseph Cornell, who's known for making shadow boxes. And the poet Charles Simic, writing about him, says, "An image hunter is how he described himself. He had no clear idea what he was looking for or what he would find. For years before he made any art, he roamed the streets in a state of expectancy." But the reason I love that quote is that you are an image hunter. Long before you've ever thought about putting something to the page, you're paying attention to what's around you. You're receptive to ideas. You have a certain alertness. And that idea that he was roaming the streets in a state of expectancy for years, that's also important. It can take very many years before you ever arrive at the material that you intend to write about. So for me, craft begins even in the beginning. What you pay attention to, it's not arbitrary. It's an internal kind of culling process. You are selecting what you're going to deem worthy to put into the poem. So that's one aspect of craft. What are you going to write about? What material are you going to use? And then craft also involves the later component. Once you have that material, how will you do it? How will you shape it? So to answer Emily's question, part of it is intuitive, at least in the early stages. And then later in the more revision type of stages, that's when you're relying on all of the knowledge and skills that you've already, practiced with, that you can incorporate again. So it's both. It's both kind of free-flowing and intuitive, and also very deliberate.
Thank you. I love that. And there's some good chatter in the chat box too about that idea of sort of being an image hunter. I love that construction kind of also honors that time away from the page, which is so important to our work. And to kind of jump off that, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your journey with this collection itself compared to your first book, maybe in terms of timeline of creation and how you came to compile this collection of poems here.
I'd be happy to. So my first book was a heavy revision of an MFA thesis, which I think might be somewhat common for a lot of people. So that meant I had a lot of work to be working with. I had taken poetry workshops, I had amassed all of this material. And with that first book, it became a matter of finding an order for it, deciding what would go in, what would go out. I had something to work with. But after that book, it was more like starting with a blank slate. I didn't have that kind of previous work to be drawing from. I was starting very much from scratch. So what happened was that I have a writing exchange with a fellow poet, on and off. Sometimes it's regular, sometimes not, where we trade poems with each other. And at a certain point, that opening poem, Why My Poems Arrive, wearing black gloves arrived. And when I wrote that poem, I kind of intuitively knew that this could be something, that I could use it, and that this could be the beginning. So that poem was the opening poem from the start. So where to go from there? I only have one poem. What I decided to do next was to keep referring back to that poem by drawing from it. So if we go back to Cornell and his shadow box, you can kind of think of a book as being shadow box. And how many compartments you decide to put in is up to you. In this case, I divided the book into 3 sections, and each of those 3 sections take their titles from that opening poem. There's Noir and Glitz, Wolf Behind the Saint, and In the Director's Cut. So those were kind of my subheadings. And when it came time to think of how to put this book together, I would think about what kinds of poems or what kinds of objects, if you will, might fit into each of those boxes. So if we think about Noir and Glitz, that made me think of things that are glamorous, things that are beautiful. So I would end up with a poem about an Oscar dress, about Dior's bar suit, figure skating, like the Johnny Weir poem that I read to you. Things that seemed to me to be very fabulous. And when it came to the noir aspect of it, I began to think about crime dramas, which I happened to be watching at the time. So that led to a few poems inspired by that. And then when it came time to think of the subsequent sections of the book, I would also think in terms of what seems to fit under this rubric that I've set up for myself. So in a certain sense, my first book had material to work with. My second book, I had to generate it and kind of learn along the way how to do it.
Yeah, I love that idea of you can have one poem and craft a book around it. I think sometimes as poets, we think that we have to have all this material before we can start to see the book almost take shape. But I love what you were saying about using that opening poem, which introduces so many different elements of the collection that we'll talk about, and then building the collection from there, that sort of inception point here, which I loved. And I loved sort of flipping through and being like, okay, I see how we're also returning back to this kind of opening idea in this section and that section. And it was great to kind of see those threads really come together throughout the collection itself. So you talked about those 3 sections for the book. I wondered if you could now talk about the other poems that are styled similarly to that opening Ars Poetica with the title, Why My Poems? Because I loved that the poems sort of argued for themselves or worked for themselves towards the reader. And I kept going back to that line in the poem that you read about the critic, right? Writing, I'm a little bored of the aesthetic, which that line, I was like, oh my gosh, you kind of roll your eyes, but you kind of, it's something that you keep going back to, right? So could you talk about that kind of style of Ars Poetica and how that also became maybe a structural element of the book for you in some way?
So in terms of a book, I think a lot of contemporary collections do have a certain structure. Sometimes you see the project book where the entire book spans one theme, or the books have a certain aboutness. You can say it's about this, it's about that. When I was sending the manuscript around, I had that sense that I would have a better chance if the book did have at least some sort of scaffolding or structure to it, because otherwise it would, become a series of best of or chronological. It needed a structure, and because the topics in the book are so wide-ranging, having those Ars Poetica poems within each section formed a kind of repetition that we could keep returning to. It's a kind of ladder for the book, if you will. And the reason that appeals to me so much is because repetition is very powerful. In some ways, repetition can become a signature. So that's one way to think of it. If you think of Claude Monet and his water lilies and his gardens, he's always painting these gardens. Maybe it's in the morning, maybe it's at night, the light changes, but it's still a garden. And yet we would never think to say he's being repetitive.
Mm.
It became his signature. I mean, among the other work that he did, clearly. But we identify him with it and it becomes powerful. So repeating a theme, repeating a structure, repeating a topic, it can be a risk, but it can also be something to embrace. The other reason for having those Ars Poetica poems is that repetition is a pleasure when the reader comes back to it. And I'll give you a visual, which might seem a little bit silly, but it's fun. So if you see one of these, right away, you know what to expect. You know that if you open it, there'll be another one. And there'll be another one again. And we have a kind of delight in seeing things in this way. There's a familiarity, but there's also a subtle difference. So every time you come back to something in the book that might have been a repetition beforehand, it's also in some way still new, ideally. So that's another reason for repetition. It's simply a joy. People find that kind of patterning in things to be a comfort. As for the Ars Poetica in particular, and responding to a critic, that was me having fun. I think at a certain point, you can't take yourself as a writer overly seriously. You can't control what the reaction or reception to it will be. Some people love your work. Some people might not resonate with it or understand it. You have to take it all in stride, and everything is material. So that one little line about, I'm a little bored with the aesthetic, what can I do about that? Sorry, I'm still gonna do what I do. So that was just me exploring what poetry means to me. There's one about, why my poems jump speed rope, or why my poems end on fire, or just all these variety of ways. It was just a way for me to enjoy writing second time around.
I love that idea of enjoyment too, right? How we find joy in our work or can create joy from our work. And it also seems like these poems kind of almost help you make sense of your own work in a way, which I think is so valuable as we grow as poets, or, from one collection to the next or one subject to the next. How do we sort of make sense of our own transformations as poets too? And it seems like this form and this repetition gives you a way to kind of do that making sense as well, which was really lovely. All right. I'm gonna ask a couple more questions and then we'll go to the chat, which I know is kind of popping with some good questions, so keep them coming. You talked about repetition, but in all of these kind of discussions that we've been having so far, you keep going back to visual art, which is another strong anchor point of this collection. There's a lot of ekphrastic poetry here, some other forms as well. There's a couple sonnets, and you also weave in this amazing pop culture imagery and references. So I thought that maybe we would talk broadly just about your relationship to form in general, how you find your footing with form or sort of negotiate form for yourself. And then we can move into thinking about the challenge of writing ekphrastic poems. And how do you kind of push yourself to go beyond just a simple description of a work of art or an Oscar dress, for instance, and really convey something new with the poems too. So a little bit of a two-parter, but you can start wherever you like.
In terms of form, for me, form and the content work together. It's very rare for me to start out a poem knowing that the form will be what the final form ends up being. I don't set out to write a sonnet and come up with 14 lines. It tends to be the other way, that I've written a poem and it feels like it should only be 14 lines. Or on other occasions, the form comes along in the process. It's not something that I've planned intuitively. In terms of the ekphrastic, that always has had this perennial appeal to me. I think it's very common for writers to love the arts. And you're right, there is a certain, I won't say caution or risk, in terms of being only descriptive, that you're only describing on the page what everyone can plainly see, there does need to be, for me, another layer to the work, whether it's introducing something personal from my own life or imagining a narrative of what might be happening in the scene, or introducing some other point of entry to the work so that it's not only description. But at the same time, when you're describing a work of art, it's very singular. We could all look at the same painting and we're all going to come up with something different. And we're all going to see things differently. Even if the color is red, someone might say it's blood red. Someone might say it's scarlet. Someone might say it's vermilion. The language that you choose to describe it is also in some ways very revealing of you as the poet. And in that way, even if the subject matter might seem as though it's been done a million times, everyone's written about this painting, no one's written it in the way that you have. So the description, it's part of it. It's not something to feel that, oh, it's only a description. That description is directed. It's guided by the language. It's very specific, and that helps to make the poem also. I think part of what mattered to me in this book also was to kind of veer from my own usual tactics. So when you think of the ekphrastic, most of the time you're going to think of something classic, like an oil painting. So this time I wanted to stretch myself a little bit and consider other forms of art. So there's a poem about an Oscar dress, which is fashion. There's the Johnny Weir poem, which is a sport that can also be an art. Why not? So for me, that also matters, that art isn't only museum art or high art or popular art. All of it is a potential source. And you should be willing to kind of explore something that you haven't done before. Why not? It might show you something new.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think something that I really responded to in going through this collection and then revisiting poems was kind of connected to what you opened our discussion about, that sense of image hunting, right? The way that anything could become this source for ekphrasis or this source for a poem. And of course, there are some more traditional visual arts reference here, but yeah, the Oscar dress I kept going back to. Also went, to go see that Oscar dress again online, which was really great. And yeah, these different kind of ways that the poems are sort of reaching outwards to those experiences. Like you said, there's that experience that only you can tell about something. If we all were looking at that Oscar dress right now, we would all be writing different poems too, which is the beauty of art and interacting with these different ideas of art as well. I'm wondering who you see yourself in conversation with, maybe as a poet, but also as an artist, someone who creates art or consumes art in different ways. How do you kind of see these different influences come into your work from the people that you're inspired by?
So I would love to be in conversation with poets, but for the most part, I try to take the stance that I'm always an apprentice. No matter how far I've gone along, it's the other poets who have something to say to me. So in that sense, I will answer in terms of influences, early influences. I have my stack here. One of the earliest collections that I dove into was Edward Hirsch, Wild Gratitude. And his work just amazed me in terms of the scope of his imagery, its forms. I was back in high school when I first came across it. It was really one of the first contemporary books, if you will. And there's also Sandra McPherson, Elegies for the Hot Season. I believe it might be out of print now, but this is the kind of book that I would lend to other people and not get it back, and then I'd have to buy it again. So if you come across a work where you find yourself buying it repeatedly, it's fantastic. There's also The Field Guide to the Heavens, rank X Gaspar. This was introduced to me in graduate school, and he uses a lot of repetition as well. There's a lot of nighttime imagery or walks through the neighborhood, and he does it just amazingly and beautifully. And the last one I'll show you is The Dig and Hotel Fiesta by Lynn Emanuel. This one combines two of her earlier books, and it's also very image dense. So if I kind of try to trace backwards to what I've read and where I've come from, I've definitely been influenced the most by those poets who do rely a lot on the visual and on images.
Thank you. And thank you for that reading list. We're all leaving here with a lot of new poets to look at if we haven't experienced them before, which is always great. I'm going to pop into the chat a little bit and scroll back. I think there was an earlier question when you mentioned exchanging work with a writer. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about your writing community, how you found that or cultivated that. What does that look like for you, maybe even in different stages of writing? I know sometimes when we're drafting, we don't want to share work with others, or we have a writing group. There's a lot of different ways that you can think about that. So yeah, what does community look like to you? And do you have advice on folks looking to find a writing community or a writing group or writing partner?
I think for me, the idea of community changes over time. When I was in my 20s, then the community was very formal. It was graduate school, it was a workshop, it was built in, it was wonderful. You've got these like-minded people surrounding you, and it's right there. But then later on, as you move away from school and you become an adult, you grow up, you go on through the rest of your life, if you will, you have to be more deliberate about finding how you're going to make that community. So for me, the way it's come about has largely been through just being out there, going to readings, giving readings. The writer I mentioned, who's a friend of mine, we were introduced to each other by another poet at a reading. That's how that happened. So sometimes community does involve many people. Sometimes it might be a class, a course that you take. Sometimes it's people that you found along the way. Sometimes it's very one-on-one. And for me, that tends to work out best because she and I both have a sense of where our work is heading and what we're doing, so we don't critique. Instead, we simply have that kind of accountability that someone is waiting for you to write something. We send it to each other. And that alone is very helpful. It's very useful. It's how we both ended up writing our second books. We had each been trading poems back and forth. So in terms of how you might find community, I would mainly say to find every local resource you can. Some libraries have writing groups. Some places like the Writer Center have all of these wonderful offerings, either virtual or in person. And as you go to them, you'll meet people in the crowd, in the audience, along with you, and you might connect.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's something very key to what you said about it's not always looking for people to critique your work as well. Sometimes you just need that accountability person to say, hey, what are you working on? Or can you send me something new? And vice versa, right? That sort of drive and that sense of togetherness in your own projects, right? And events, readings, workshops, all of these are great ways to start finding that community. So thank you. There was another question from Nancy earlier in the chat about when can you call yourself a poet, which I think is a kind of provocative question. So thank you, Nancy. When at a certain point do you feel that you were able to maybe consider yourself a poet, Karen, in your journey? Or maybe what might hold one back from really identifying as a poet or allowing themselves to be identified as a poet?
I think in terms of being a poet or any writer, really, you need to separate the idea of writing from publication or so-called success, because they are two separate things. So you're a poet the moment you're writing a poem. I mean, it's as simple as that. Why not? But I do understand the feeling that it's not being a real poet if you somehow haven't reached a certain benchmark that you're striving for, or that you haven't quite gotten to where you think that you should be. But I would let all of that go, because you never know. Things take a very long time, and you have to separate that aspect of it from doing the work. It's the work itself that matters. You're a poet the minute you're image hunting. It starts at the beginning. So you should just have that kind of confidence.
Yeah, I completely agree with that as well, especially separating, right, publication from your work as a poet, which can exist in all these different ways, right? From where you turn your attention on your daily walks, or what you write down in your journals, or what you keep for yourself, right? Not everything we write is even for other people too. So yeah, to everyone out there who's maybe feeling like you're not quite there yet, you are a poet. So keep going. And wherever that journey leads you, or wherever you want that journey to take you, you're still there. So that's wonderful. Thank you. Great. Awesome. Thank you for these questions, everyone. Keep them coming. I'm just going to scroll down. Question from Leslie. Do you work in other art forms besides poetry?
Once in a while, I dabble a little bit with essays, but I haven't published any of those. And in terms of other art forms, I would love to say that I do, but I didn't. So for me, I've tended to be a one-trick pony. Poetry is where I place my focus.
Wonderful. Thank you. And this is an interesting question too. Maybe takes us back to some of the earlier discussion from Diana. I'm curious how you know you've birthed a poem. When sort of going with this metaphor, how do you know when gestation is complete? So maybe in that early drafting phase, how do you know when what you have going is a poem, or something to keep kind of pursuing or working with in that way?
So to answer that in maybe a roundabout way, one of the things I do with my poems is read them out loud a lot. And when I've gotten to the point where I can read them out loud with a certain kind of fluidity, or I just know that it's got the music down, it's working, that's when I know that this is a poem. Because before that, if a line isn't quite working out, you're going to hear it. If it isn't flowing well, you're also going to hear that. So that process of reading aloud shows a lot. It reveals a lot of where the poem is at the moment.
Wonderful. Yeah. I had a question kind of also about musicality, because that's something that I noticed within your poems, is this attention to the music of the lines, but also the music of the imagery. There's a lot of movement in these images. Of course, the figure skating images kind of are full of movement and music in their own ways. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about embracing that kind of movement of a poem, maybe even in terms of lines and line breaks, how you embrace movement along with that kind of musicality of the line as well.
Well, line breaks are one of my most favorite aspects of poetry. In a certain sense, every poem has a kind of internal logic or an argument, and I don't mean in terms of a thesis, but it's laying out a pattern or series of thoughts so that you can convey something to your reader. And how you do that with a certain degree of clarity. You have many tools. You have grammar, you've got syntax, you've got word choice, and so on. But one of those tools is also the line break. Because the line break is how you can kind of control the timing and the speed at which you're doling out that information to your readers. You might have a very leisurely and long line length. It's winding. You might have a very rapid, clippy, sort of snappy poem. All of that affects how your reader will be able to get into that. So the line break is important in terms of kind of laying out the path for your reader to follow. But it's more than that also. It's also a way to emphasize. Sometimes if I want to really place the emphasis on a particular image or a particular verb and movement or a scene, that warrants not just a line break, but a stanza break. That extra space, that white space, that extra beat, that plays into what the content is. Sometimes if I want to introduce a certain amount of surprise or unexpectedness, or to maybe play with the double meaning of a word, then maybe that line will be enjammed. And you don't know what's coming next until you've read the next line. Sometimes the line might be complete, just a sentence in itself and stop. It depends on what you're writing about, but that line break really is how you kind of control the speed, the flow, the timing, the meaning, all of that plays into it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, I really noticed a lot of those kind of key interchanges at the end of the line where you're in that space of not knowing, but also kind of expectation of what's coming next, and then surprise when you finally kind of tumble over those enjambments. And again, a lot of great kind of physical movement on the page alongside the movement of the images as well. So yeah, we could probably talk about line breaks for the rest of our time together, as poets often do. But thank you for indulging that question as well. And also the impact of a line break on that initial musicality too, kind of takes us back there. Let me go back up in the chat here. Katie's wondering if you could speak a little bit about your publishing journey, which I think is a great question because this is your second book, and a lot of times the second book is a different process than getting that first book published. So could you talk about that process for you, maybe that first book, and then how you ended up placing your second book with JackLeg Press?
So for me, poetry has been a very long journey across decades. My first publication was actually in a tiny little local newspaper when I was a teenager. That's how I began. I started locally, and I started publishing in journals. Eventually, later on, I published 2 chapbooks and then the subsequent books. As for the how, with my first book, I wrote that one ages ago. It came out in 2012. And back then, I think it was kind of a common idea that for a first poetry book, you'd go down the contest route for whatever reason. Maybe it had to do with coming out of a graduate school program or reading lots of people's collections that had won a prize. So I thought that was the way to go. And that's what I did. I submitted and I submitted, and eventually it did win a prize at a university press. Now, with my second book, that came along nearly a decade later. The publication day is like a dozen years apart in between books. By then, I think the landscape had changed a lot. There's a lot of indie presses, a lot of small presses. It doesn't have to go through that contest route. In fact, if you're submitting, I would say to consider kind of widening the net, if you will. The fees become pretty expensive when you're submitting. So it's a good thing that there are all of these other avenues and presses that you can kind of send your work to. The way it happened is that for a while I sent to some contest and it was a semi-finalist, it was a finalist, the book wasn't getting to where I wanted it to be. And at some point I sent it to my publisher, JackLeg Press. At that time, they asked for queries where you could submit just a little sample and then they would come back to you and tell you if they wanted to read the entire manuscript. And then they did, and then that's how that one unfolded. So in terms of the path to publication, it's going to look different for everyone. Some people manage it quickly, some people take many, many years, some people, manage a large press, small press. As long as you're happy with the result, I think that kind of where did it come from is not nearly as important.
Mm. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's key to think about how the publishing landscape has changed and is continuing to change. And also something that you mentioned as well is those submission fees, how they do tend to add up. And so kind of being strategic about knowing a press where you think your work might be a good fit, and also, of course, exploring things outside of contests like small publishers who can also give some good attention to the work as well. So thank you for that, and thank you for that question. A couple more questions about kind of movement within the line. So maybe we'll jump to those before we get too far away from that previous discussion. One question asking about meter or maybe a metrical focus. And another question, does rhythm control line breaks or sense, or maybe alongside sense, something like meaning making? So yeah, a couple questions kind of thrown at you there just about meter or a metrical focus if you have one, and then what controls the line break, the rhythm or meaning, or maybe it's a combination of both for you.
In terms of the line break, it's on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes it is the rhythm, sometimes it's the meaning. As far as meter goes, I'm not formally counting. I mean, I'm not counting iambic pentameter and so on. For me, it's the reading out loud that directs a lot of it. And I love the question about sense. One of the early little tidbits that I was given was that little quote from Alexander Pope about the sound must seem an echo to the sense. Mm-hmm. So in terms of musicality or finding a rhythm, it has to do with breath or reading it. The way I read a poem won't be the way that you read a poem, but if you read your own poem out loud, you'll start to get a sense for how it should go.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's always my number one recommendation in terms of approaching your work in revision or even after that first draft is always read it out loud. It always helps me notice something about the work, maybe something about the way the poem is moving, or it can help kind of attune you to the sticky points in the poem, like, oh, this isn't quite working because the musicality is not working, right? Something's not fitting. So yeah, definitely read your work out loud, even if it's just to yourself. It doesn't have to be to an audience yet. Wonderful. We had a question about your writing habits. So what does your kind of daily writing life look for you? Do you write every day? How do you approach the page? Maybe this connects back to our earlier ideas about kind of image hunting and things like that. So yeah, what's that daily writing process like for you?
So it differs for every writer. Some writers are very disciplined and other writers less so. I fall in that latter camp. I don't write daily, but I am really a strong believer that you are working on the writing even when you're not writing. So that goes back to that Cornell quote, and I'll just give you the last bit again. For years before he made any art, he roamed the streets in a state of expectancy. It's that state of expectancy that you are paying attention to what's around you, to what you're taking in. So the writing is happening in the back of your mind long before it hits the page. So even when it doesn't look like it. For example, with the Johnny Weir poem I read, over the pandemic, I went down the YouTube rabbit hole. I was watching figure skating championships, and that doesn't look like writing whatsoever. But later on, the poem came out of that. So you shouldn't feel too harsh with yourself if you're not a daily writer, you're not getting your 1,000 words or whatever it is. Everyone is going to come by it differently. And you just kind of have to accept that time is part of the process. I mean, by all means, if it does help you to write daily, then do that. And if it doesn't, just know that part of you is still working on it, even when you're not there.
Yeah. Yeah, we can be kind of chewing on an idea even before we realize that it's an idea for a poem. And I think that sense of being generous with ourselves and the time that we take on the page and also away from the page, and not get bogged down by, oh, I wasn't productive today. I didn't write a poem today, or I didn't fill my word quota today. Well, think about the other things that you did in that day that do inform your writing in some way, or will inform your writing in a way that you might not see yet too. It is a great way of kind of reframing that time, which is so limited for all of us too. Good. Just glancing at our time now, we have about 10 minutes left, and I saw a request if we could hear maybe another poem. Karen, would you be down to read another poem for us, since we've been talking so much about musicality and reading out loud?
Sure. So give me a minute to settle on one here. Yeah. Okay. I'll read you the poem that contains the book's title at some point. Derby hats. Cartwheel hats, feathers and fascinators at Churchill Downs, each one a ringed planet. Give me the black picture hat, danger slung over one eye, a hat to stop thoroughbreds in their paddocks. Not the ay caramba hat, loud as a multiplex, or the upbeat Breton in pastel straw, but the milliner's best Fabulosa hat, paired with elbow-length gloves. You know the one, Gloria Swanson's poolside brim, taking its place in the sun, not the veiled pillbox, revival peach baskets, buckets or planches. I want the glamorous panther skulking right in the center of the grandstand. The silk funereal hat adorned with nothing but a lethal pin. The merciless hat, the damned hat blocked on a wooden mold, shaped to midnight perfection, hat a villainous wears on coastal drives. I want the Hollywood hat to motor in, the hat they'll book me in.
Thank you. Thank you for reading that one too. It was so great to not only hear the kind of musicality of the language, but also the textures. You just really feel all of the layers of movement and musicality, and the ways that we move through all of those images in that poem. So thank you. I love that one. All right, I'd love to ask maybe two more questions. So we'll start with the question about revision. How do you approach revision once you have that draft of a poem? Do you have targeted revision strategies? Do you kind of take it on a poem by poem basis for considering how you approach it after that early draft? And does that look different for you when thinking about a collection versus a single poem on its own?
So each poem has its own process. On really rare occasions, you might write a poem that seems to arrive almost whole, and that's the poem. That doesn't happen very often. Other times, there might be a poem that requires a couple of revisions. Sometimes it might be a poem that never quite works out. You put it in a drawer, and then years later, suddenly you figured it out. So it's going to be different each time. In terms of being kind of more strategic or specific, I tend to go in the direction of less is more, especially in terms of a book. If we go back to the original talk about Cornell and his shadow boxes, the shadow box is not very big. It's very contained, and having that kind of containment obliges me to make sure that every single thing I put in there had better belong there. So it will result in a smaller book, but in hopefully a book where I can feel that I gave the best of what I was able to give at that particular time. That doesn't mean perfection. There is no perfection. But it does mean that I've attended to all of the little details so that hopefully my reader will come to enjoy it. Because for me, it's better to have a smaller book that works, however you want to define works, than to maybe have kind of a sprawling book that's full of filler and repetitions that didn't seem necessary, or where you might feel this could have been half the size, it could have been 2 books. So for me, revision is a lot about selection, being very, very selective about what's going to go into this particular container. So that's one form of revision. Another form of revision for me in terms of the book happened in terms of replacing. It took me a long time sending the manuscript around and around and around. And in the original version I was sending around, I did have like 1 or 2 poems that I needed to meet a page count. I wanted to start being finished with this, with the poems in there. But then later on, after it had been accepted, I replaced it with another poem that I felt was stronger and arguably better for that particular section of the book. So sometimes the revision happens even afterwards. You can come to expect that. Once the book is accepted, there will be little changes that you want to make along the way. It's an ongoing process, and it's never a chore for me. It's making the work as good as you possibly can. In that sense, it's a delight.
Yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, as someone mentioned in the chat, I think Katie mentioned that idea of kind of replacing a poem, achieving that manuscript so that you can submit it and it's the best it can be at that time, but then maybe revisiting it and saying, oh, I have this poem that actually can replace that weaker one, and sort of being able to know your strengths and your kind of opportunities within a collection too, I think is really great advice too. So our final question is, what is your go-to craft advice for a writer who is trying to approach their work?
I think I'll borrow from other writers. I've heard it said that the best line in the poem is the poem that you're reading. And that seems like a nearly impossible sky-high standard. Every single line needs to be bang on the mark, the title, everything. So that's kind of aspirational. It's not necessarily going to happen all of the time, but in terms of craft, it does come back to the line. You read the poem the whole way through, there should be something that intrigues you, that pulls you through it, that is just really evocative for your reader. So that kind of minuscule intensity that would to pay attention to all.
And that really takes us kind of full circle to our opening kind of discussion about paying attention to what's around us. Right now we're thinking about paying attention to all of those little moments in a poem. And as you said about the manuscript, right? The poem and a manuscript can be a container, and everything has to be sharp. So I love that. Every line needs to be the best line. Wonderful. Right, let me just see if there's any more questions in the chat here from folks before we sadly bid farewell. A question about languages. Do you write in Spanish at all? From Sam.
I was born in Panama, and my parents speak Spanish. I also speak Spanish, but my ability to write it is not the same as it is in English. In English, I have way more flexibility in terms of idioms and metaphors, and I can say the same thing 10 different ways. In Spanish, I might only know like the one way to say it. So I have written a couple of poems in Spanish, but it's not something that I have explored deeply. So in terms of Fabulosa, the title is there just kind of as a nod to my background and to my heritage, and because it sounds a lot better than saying fabulous, Fabulosa, I simply chose it. But Spanish for me is not my main writing.
Wonderful, thank you. And maybe we'll end on this question, since we've been talking about art in different ways. Mark is wondering what the painting is behind you.
Oh, okay. So this painting, I have forgotten the title, but it's a Peruvian artist named Teodoro Requeiza. There's tiny little llamas, which you can't see from there. It's just that have.
Wonderful. Maybe we'll get some ekphrastic poems about the painting in some way. Well, Karen, thank you so much for your generosity this evening, for everything that you shared in terms of your process and your work and your poems. I really appreciate it. And thank you to our audience for all of your questions and for being here, spending this hour talking about poetry with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
And just a reminder, please, please, please buy a copy of the book if you don't have one already. You heard some of the poems tonight, so I know you'll want to get your hands on a copy as soon as possible. And Karen, thank you again for this evening. It was really lovely to get to pick your brain about all of these wonderful images and poems.